You're listening to Crossword, where cultural clues lead to the truth of the word. And my name is Michelle McAloon, your host. I love podcasting. I love books. But the reason why I like doing a nonfiction book podcast is because some of the incredible people that I get to converse with, that I get to share these conversations with you. And today is a prime example of that. This is Professor Robert Darnton. He is a scholar's scholar. He has been for decades a professor of 18th century history, of the French Revolution, of the French literary movement. He is actually a national treasure, and we are so lucky to be able to have a man like this in our colleges and universities who's taught for so many decades and to be a guest on this show. So hopefully you will appreciate this interview and maybe understand a little bit more about revolution, because we need to understand that right now and not throw those words around so lightly. If you enjoy the show, please share it with a friend. The best way this show gets out is through word of mouth. And if you want to know more about me, you can find out on bookclues.com. Thanks, guys. God bless. Okay, folks, today we have a very eminent historian, Professor Robert Darnton. Professor Darnton is the author of many award-winning works in French cultural history and has taught for years at Princeton and Harvard. He is a Chevalier and the Légion d'Honneur and winner of the National Humanities Medal. Professor Darnton, you've written a lot, and you really are an expert in French cultural history, especially revolutionary cultural history. Is correct?
Well, yes, I've written quite a few books. It's true. I've spent my whole life studying not just French history, but the history of books, the history of communication, the study of how ideas spread in society, how public opinion is formed. And all of that has bearing, I think, on the coming of the French Revolution.
Absolutely. And, that's a history that has not stopped. That is a history that we continue to live in. And one of the reasons why I was attracted to your book and why I wanted to speak to you is we kind of think we live in a media bubble now, right? That this is new, this is different, that it is noisier than it's ever been. But actually, I think you're writing, and especially the book that we're going to talk about today, The Revolutionary Temper, Paris 1748 through 1789, you really show how information actually helped formulate the revolution in the imagination of the Parisian people.
Yes, that's exactly what I attempt to do. People often say today, as if it were something startling and new, we live in an information age. But of course, every age is an age of information, each in its own way, according to the media available at that time. So if you follow that line of reasoning as far as it will go, you could come up with some surprising conclusions, including a new interpretation of how the French Revolution happened. Now, there's a vast literature, of course, on the coming of the French Revolution. Wonderful. It's a wonderful, rich subject. But I think this aspect has not been adequately discussed at all. Namely, how did Paris in particular function as an information society? What were the media at that time? What were their effects? How did they communicate views of the world and news? So that my attempt is to reconstruct the way events were not just reported, but perceived during the 40 years before the revolution.
Okay, why did you decide on 40 years? Why? I know that was kind of the end of the War of the Austrian Succession, but why did you choose to look at those 4 decades leading up to the revolution?
Well, I didn't want to write, yet another general history of France or of Paris. So I needed a starting point, and I thought the mid-century years were crucial, would be a good time to start. I could have gone back farther, of course. I could have gone back 100 years or 200 years.
Right.
But I wanted I needed enough time span to show how there was a cumulative process of building up a public consciousness about things, but I didn't want to bog the reader's attention down into a detailed account of everything that happened during the 18th century. So the end of the War of the Austrian Succession is really a good starting point, I think. And I, in fact, begin by asking, what did ordinary people know about a war, this war between 1740 and 1748? How did they get information about it and about its resolution in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle? In other words, what did war and peace mean to ordinary people? Well, if you ask that question, it becomes instantly very interesting because I did a lot of research to find out how the information was transmitted. Now, there were no newspapers in France at this time, not newspapers in the modern sense of the word, with news about public events. The first daily newspaper in France was the Journal de Paris, and it didn't begin until 1777, and it was very heavily censored. So how did people know about this war? Well, working people. They had to pay higher taxes, especially on consumer objects. Things were tough. And there was gossip about the occasional battle, but people's geography was pretty vague. They didn't know exactly where the armies were. They may have heard about the Maréchal de Saxe, who was a famous general, but only vaguely. And meanwhile, there were conflicts over the whole globe because there was a colonial dimension to it all, and people didn't really have a clear idea of where all of these naval battles took place. So when the peace was declared, people knew about it because it was published. But what does it mean to publish something in a city that has got a lot of illiteracy? The publication was actually a parade, an enormous parade with about 800 people, all of them dressed in great costumes, on horses, on foot, several traveling bands that played music. It went through Paris for a whole day, stopping at, I forget the exact number, about 20 neighborhood centers. The parade would stop, the band would play, trumpets blared, and a royal herald would read out a proclamation that the peace existed and there was to be no more conflict between the English and the French, and then it passed on. So what I'm saying is the concept of publication as a parade shows you how information reached ordinary people. And then afterwards, there was a celebration in the traditional way, namely dancing in 15 different neighborhoods where or orchestras were set out. People danced. There was a lot of whooping and hollering, free sausages, free wine, free bread, and then a fireworks display. Well, people adored fireworks. Fireworks were rather different in the 18th century, but this is a high moment of celebration. And in fact, what happened during the fireworks, where everyone gathered in the Place de l'Hôtel de Ville, they were crammed together. And after the fireworks, some people tripped and others fell over the tripped people. And there was a kind of stampede. And in fact, at least a dozen people were killed. So the piece is actually experienced as a catastrophe. And the next day, there are reports that among the fishmongers in Paris, when they got into a quarrel and wanted to insult one another, they would say, "Tu es bête comme la paix." You are as stupid as the peace.
Oh,
So,
no. Okay.
so what I'm saying is, I could go into it in more detail, notably about the war itself. How did people know about it? But my point is information does reach ordinary people, not simply the elite. And when it does, it takes a particular twist, a turn, in this case, through the publication and the fireworks, which came off as a disaster.
You show through a series of vignettes of how the people lost trust in the government, whether it was over taxation, whether it was over being able to protect them. And this is one of those incidents where they had heard about this piece, but there was conflicting evidence with this piece, right? Let me ask you a basic question here. What was the literacy rate? Do they have any idea of like how many people could read in Paris at this time?
Yes.
Yeah,
Well, as you could imagine, there's an enormous debate among historians about
sure.
rates of literacy. It matters. I mean, this is, after all, the age of enlightenment, when the ideas of the great philosophers were supposedly setting a new tone to public life. Uh, Unfortunately, the sources are very imperfect, and a lot of them were destroyed with the bombardment of Paris in 1871. But
Hmm,
we do have some parish registers, and basically, you're trying to figure out how many people could sign their names. And then
right.
we have studies of teaching, and it turns out that you learn to read before you learn to write. So if you could sign your name, that's an indication that you probably could read. But how well could you read? Could ordinary people who would count as literate in that they could sign their names, could they read their way through a pamphlet or a book? Not many, I think. Still, most historians would agree that literacy rates are much higher for men than for women. They're higher in the northeast of France from the way they are in the southwest. Paris, although we don't have statistics for Paris, was probably quite illiterate. So it's fair to say that most, maybe 75% or more of adult males could read, or at least decipher writing and printing in an adequate way, but probably not adequate for reading philosophic treatises. So we
Right.
face a problem. How did they know about if they knew at all about philosophic treatises? And
Right.
that's fascinating. How do you get at the actual diffusion of ideas in a semi-literate society?
That's kind of a question I had because again, talking about the supposed peace after the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, you had contradictory reports, and this was being talked about in the cafes. So you would assume that would be upper middle class, maybe to even the elites at that point. And the workers, the porters, the fishmongers, everybody else. What is bridging that gap between the two? Because I would think that would be very heavily demarcated between those who are actually talking about ideas and those who are actually working and then hearing the rumors about the ideas.
Well, I think you're right in indicating that the elite, the people who met in cafes and especially in salons, discussed ideas. They did a lot besides, actually. Mainly they played cards. But there were indeed philosophic discussions, and they read books, and a huge cultural distance separates them from ordinary worker. Now, there's been some wonderful study of what people owned, what bits of property appear in their wills after their death, because there's an inventory of all of their property. And by the late 18th century, books begin to appear, but different kinds of books, what we call chapbooks, little pamphlets about saints' lives or the adventures of King Arthur at the Round Table. I mean, that's quite far from the philosophy of Diderot and Montesquieu and Rousseau. So there is this cultural gap, and yet ideas don't simply filter down. Sometimes they move from the bottom upward. Take the idea of despotism. Now, despotism is a key category in the way people think about governments. And it's really invented, or reinvented at least, by Montesquieu, so one of the great four of the philosophers, who said all governments are either monarchies or republics or despotisms. That's very different from Aristotle's division. Despotism appears as a new kind of government. Now, the French, and this is a central argument of my book, felt they were being ground down by a despotic system. Not the king, but the ministers. It's a ministerial despotism. How did they get to that idea? Well, they did through reports of events and their own gossip about events. So, for example, early in the book, I talk about the kidnapping of the prince, Bonnie
Yeah,
Prince Charlie, we call
yeah,
him
that's good.
in
Yeah.
English. In the French, called him Prince Édouard. But the point is, he was a kind of hero to ordinary Parisians. He would walk through the streets. He had a lot of swaggering, and he led the attempt to invade the enemy, England, and failed, came back. But by 1748, he's a real popular hero. However, the treaty required the French to expel him because he was a pretendant to the English throne, and that's what the English demanded in the treaty. How did they get rid of him? Well, first, of course, Louis XV tried to persuade him to leave. And, to make things easy for him, if only he would comply with the terms of the treaty. But no, instead, he paraded around Paris. Parisians are cheering him. He particularly showed up at the opera. So you get a kind of parading around of this popular hero who's a champion of the anti-English forces. And what does a king finally do? I call it kingnapping because he's a pretendant to the throne.
Right.
He's kingnapped. That is, he's about to go in the opera. He's suddenly mugged by a group of soldiers. They lift him into the air, take away the pistols that were in his pocket, drag him, carry him off. And the streets are lined with soldiers all the way to the prison of Vincennes. So
Right.
he is then rushed out of central Paris, taken to a dungeon in Vincennes, and finally taken out of the kingdom. But the Parisians witness this. They see it happening. And so their hero is a victim of despotism. And people are talking about that, ordinary people in the streets. We know this because, fortunately for the historian, there are lots and lots of sources. There are private diaries, there's correspondence, there are police reports. The police had, according to some estimates, 3,000 spies that scatter around the city and send in reports about what people are talking about in marketplaces and in cafes and at crossroads, etc. So I think I can prove that there was a powerful reaction to the kingnapping of Bonnie Prince Charlie that took the form of shock at despotism. And that's way back in 1748-49. By the time you get to 1788 and 89, the theme of despotism has grown and grown through a whole series of rather spectacular events. And
Right.
that's my, in a way, central argument that a consciousness of despotism, the abuse of power, the arbitrary power of the government, this has provoked a profound reaction among Parisians who feel their government is no longer legitimate. It's the basic sense of legitimacy has eroded.
You've got the figure of the king. You've got Louis XV, who, he reigns for 59 years or something. I mean, he reigns for a long, long time. Dies of smallpox. Louis XVI comes in. But where the position of the king, and not even the king, but Versailles and the ministers, this royal aura, the Legrand, and you show kind of a 40-year trajectory downward of the trust in absolute monarchy. It becomes associated with despotism, and despotism becomes a bad thing in the mind of the people.
Yes. Well, it's a long, complex story, but it's fascinating and I think fun for the reader because these episodes are not just abstract debates about the nature of government. That does take place, of course, but they are actual events that that resonate and are quite spectacular. I mean, one example is 1750 is it concerns the common people of Paris, where there were urchins, street kids,
Yeah.
disturbing pedestrians. These urchins often were abandoned children who walked into Paris from the countryside, were begging, robbing, creating a fuss, and the police were ordered to clear the streets of vagrant kids. Well, they did that, but while doing it, they picked up some children of artisans and bourgeois as well. These kids were taken to a prison, but the rumor spread that they were actually going to be sent to Mississippi,
Right,
where
right. Yeah.
the French, the word had spread that Mississippi was this mountainous country that had a silk industry developed. I mean, it's completely crazy, but
Right, right. I'm from
that's what
Alabama,
people
so
believe.
we have a lot to say about Mississippi, so
But it's interesting. You see, you've got this mythological country in the eyes of ordinary people to which the kidnapped children are going to be sent as slaves to work in the silk industry. Sometimes, when they were actually picked up by the police, thrown into wagons, carriages to be carried off to prison, the children would shout and people would come pouring out and would stop the wagon, beat up the policeman who had kidnapped them, and sometimes violence would spread. You would have an actual riot. In fact, the word for riot in 18th century French, there are lots of words, but the one I find is especially interesting is émotion populaire, popular emotion. There's an emotional, affective side to all of this. In any case, later on in 1750, a mob takes one of these kidnappers, a police agent, beats him to death, drags his body to the front door of the head of the police force. The lieutenant general of police runs out the back door, and the mob just takes over Paris for a while. So you've got this popular emotion which is spreading on a very large scale and shows how vulnerable the city actually is to mass violence. And then the interesting thing is a rumor spreads that the
right.
reason for the kidnapping is not just Mississippi, but to bleed the children in order to make a blood bath in which a prince of the blood will bathe himself in order to cure himself from an exotic disease, leprosy. And
Okay,
that
that's
goes
horrible.
back
Yeah.
to, ancient views about Herod and the massacre of the innocents and that sort of thing. This is the kind of rumor that accompanies an outbreak of violence. It's reported to Louis XV, and he's horrified. He says, if the Parisians treat me as a Herod, I'm not going to go to Paris anymore. And he actually has a road built around Paris so that when he wants to go hunting at Compiègne from Paris, from Versailles, he doesn't have to set foot in the city. And he rarely went to Paris after that, actually. So there's a kind of divorce between the king and the people that you can follow by studying rumors and events of this kind.
And Versailles really lit their imagination because of they had the secret de roi, right? Whatever the king did was secret, and it was and anytime you've got secret in the human imagination will fill in the space, from that time to this time today. Believe me, I work for
Y
the Vatican, so
Yes,
I
that's
but
quite true. That's
yeah,
quite true. However, people assumed that the king's secret, which is politics, if you like, was correct. I mean, that was reality. That's the way public affairs were always done. So it's not as if anyone thought that the people themselves should participate in public affairs, at least not at first. I tried to show how that changes by
Right.
the time you reach 1789. But one of the interesting episodes in the changing of that attitude is the publication in 1781 of something called Le Compte Rendu, or it's really a kind of pamphlet version of the budget of the king. Now, nothing was more secret than the expenditure of the king's treasures. No minister was responsible to any institution or to the general public about the way the money was spent. All of this was the king's affair. But this minister, Necker is his name, actually was courting public opinion and trying to mobilize support in the general public so that he would not be thrown out of Versailles. He was a Protestant. He was Swiss. The courtiers all hated him as a kind of alien, but he was a very capable banker and needed to run the royal finances. So he published this budget with a preface which indicated that the people, the common people, should be informed about what had been the king's secret. And suddenly finance is opened up as an issue, and people begin debating about exactly how big the debt is and how it could be solved, through what responsibility the king had for taxing the people or lifting taxes. And you've got a whole series of pamphlets from 1781 to 1789 about the royal finances. So that's another example I cite as to the way this notion of the king's secret is undercut, and a new notion appears, which is the nation itself should be responsible for determining public business.
They come upon an idea of sovereignty of the nation versus sovereignty in a person. One thing I thought was really interesting, because in your conclusion, you talk about, one of the things that was part of this revolutionary temper was the age of reason. But you show some examples where actually the Catholic Church lost a lot of credibility, and it was between the Jansenists and then the Jesuits. Will you talk a little bit about that? Because that's interesting that in the end, the republic, the secular republic, actually grows out of some of these issues.
Yes, I mean, I assume that most modern readers won't know much about Jansenism,
I'm
and
probably not, right?
probably not much about Jesuitism either. So that's one of the challenges I face. I mean, how can I make understandable and interesting to modern readers seemingly esoteric things like Jansenism,
Right.
which actually is a strain within the Catholic Church, as you know, because you're a canon lawyer, but most people don't know. It's the Augustinian strain, which stresses sinfulness and austerity. The Jesuits, on the other hand, had a completely different concept of sin and were very linked with the court and the king through the king's confessor. Well, a conflict developed between the Jansenists on the one hand and the Jesuits on the other. It wasn't really a turf battle. It was a battle for the loyalty and the adherence of the elite and then of the common people. Now, what made this dramatic for the ordinary Parisians was an order made by the Archbishop of Paris, who favored the Jesuits against the Jansenists, that if someone is dying on that person's deathbed, that person must accept a particular papal bull condemning Jansenism. That means now deathbed scenes really mattered to people. There was a belief that if you could manage to make a good death, to accept your sins and confess them, that you would be assured of going to heaven. There were even clubs that practiced a good death. And, there were brotherhoods of uh, penitents to practice this so that you could, at the crucial moment, get into heaven. People believed deeply that this was, in a way, the most important moment of your life. And for the king, the archbishop first, to intervene and deprive people of the sacraments at this last crucial moment seemed a tremendous abuse of power that everyone could understand. Well, ultimately, the king backed the Jesuits, so to speak, against the Jansenists. There were a whole series of episodes. There were gigantic processions to memorial services for the people who had died and been deprived of the last sacraments. And this inflamed public opinion terribly. So, and then there was a popular version of Jansenism, quite different from the theological version where Pascal and other great thinkers were involved. The popular version had to do with a priest in a fairly poor neighborhood of Paris called the Diacre Paris. He was known for being very, very strict self-flagellation, wearing a hair shirt, and being good to the poor. He died, and when people saw his tomb in the cemetery of the church of Saint-Médard in this poor section of Paris, they found that when they touched the tomb, they were cured of disease. And they believed that, as in the Middle Ages, he had a kind of sacred power. He was a saint. And so they gathered around his tomb, and people would touch the tomb and then fall into convulsions by the power of God. And these convulsions spread, and soon you got among working people, poor people, a whole cult of convulsionaries, as they were called.
Right.
And then, sure enough, the government called in the troops. They shut off the cemetery. They wouldn't let people get near the tomb. And on it, someone put a placard up on the fence around the tomb, which in French is very witty. It says, "De par le roi défense à Dieu de faire miracle en ce lieu." God is forbidden by order of the king to make any miracles in this place. Well, it's a wonderful, witty thing, but what it expresses is, again, this hatred of despotism, this sense that the king himself is violating the order of God by preventing people from exercising their spirituality. So it's things like this that really ignite a passion of resentment, hatred of arbitrary power.
But let's go from the church, the sublime, to the blatant. You talk about really the corrupt morals of the aristocrats also brought it down. Let's talk about the mistresses of the king and how they were actually celebrities in their own right, but kind of anti-heroes, right?
Yes, they
Among the
were.
public.
That's right. But, the French assumed that the kings had mistresses. I mean, that went way back. There's nothing in itself as shocking. Royal marriages were diplomatic affairs. And of course, the king had mistresses. But he should have a certain kind of mistress in the eyes of the general public. They should be ladies. Well, Madame de Pompadour was the daughter of a bourgeois, and she had a very unfortunate maiden name, Poisson, fish. So when she was made mistress, the entitled mistress, maîtresse en titre, and actually introduced to the court, all kinds of poems circulated about this fish woman. And they're very funny. I mean, Paris is flooded with these things. So there were so many that they acquired a special name as a genre. They were poissonnade. Fish rhymes, if you like.
That's funny.
And so there is this sense that the monarchy is being dragged down and besmirched by a commonality. It's losing its luster as being high and mighty and distinguished. And then, of course, Madame de Pompadour interferes in the affairs of state and is given fabulous presents, including what is today the Élysée Palace, where the president of France lives, and chateaus, Chateau de Bellevue, diamonds, and so on. There's a lot of scandal about we're being taxed to death, and these extravagant presents are being thrown at this unworthy person. And then she begins to name ministers because she interferes in politics. Louis XV himself is rather bored by it. And she names two of the most disliked ministers of the whole century. And even that the commanding general during the next war, the 7 Years' War, the Prince de Soubise, who, when he leads out a gigantic French army, is roundly defeated by Frederick the Great, who has less than half the number of troops. And so she's blamed for the humiliation of the French losses as well. All of this builds up into a tremendous hatred, really, of Madame de Pompadour. It's put into songs, and in the book, I stress the importance of street songs because, songs are great mnemonic devices. All of us today carry around in our heads tunes that everyone else knows.
Right, yeah.
And I've done a long study, wrote a whole book about street songs and their power because they have been recorded in song books called chansonniers. And these songbooks are astonishing documents. They're enormous, 39 or 40 volumes in the Chansonnier Maurepas, more in the Chansonnier Clérambault. So I've read hundreds and hundreds of these words that are recorded at the time and then copied into sort of scrapbooks, but they're set to tunes. So they always say, to the tune of, sur l'air de. And
Okay.
then I did statistics to figure out which were the tunes that everyone knew. What was the common repository of music? And fortunately, in the musicology department of the National Library in Paris, you can go to keys that give you the actual musical annotation of the songs. So you look
Oh,
up
wow. Okay.
La Béquille du Père Barnabas. No one's ever heard of that today, but I look it up by the title. I get the musical annotation. And a friend of mine, Hélène Delaveau, is a cabaret singer in Paris. And she recorded these songs, uh,
Okay.
and they're available on my website so that the reader can actually hear songs pretty much as they were sung to the actual music in the streets of Paris. And these songs they vary, they're about everything, but many of them are highly critical of the government. So songs, I argue, are a kind of oral newspaper that fills the air of Paris. There's street singers at every corner. People sing at work, and they love inventing new words to old tunes which communicate understanding of current events. In fact, one of my chapters, I talk about the collapse of the French government, that is the leading minister who's fired by the king in 1749. All of the contemporaries agree the government collapsed because of songs. And one particular song, I can't sing it to you, but if you like, I can give you the words.
Okay.
But isn't that interesting that it's common belief that the government fell because of a song? Now, the song, well, it's very short. By your charming and frank manner, Iris, you enchant our hearts. You sow on our path flowers, but they are white flowers.
White
Now, to
flowers.
the modern reader, that doesn't mean anything at all. It sounds rather gallant. But in fact, it was a kind of, white flowers meant menstrual
Right.
venereal disease that spread through menstrual fluid. So the song says the king's mistress has given him VD, and that's
Okay.
pretty powerful stuff. So that's an example, and I won't go into all the details, but the point is the minister was compromised as the author of this song, and therefore his government fell and he was exiled to the provinces.
That's right, because he gave the white flowers at the dinner party. She gave him the white flowers, and he was making a joke about the white flowers, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
That's right.
that's it. Well, how did the information about the intimate information about Madame Pompadour, and then, I mean, he goes for a real floozy, Madame du Barry, right? And then he goes after sisters. I mean, this guy he was a little randy, Louis XV.
Right.
He was having his fun, but how does that filter down to the people? How does that go from noble, to prince of the blood, to down to the bourgeoisie, down to the fishmonger? How did that flow in French in that time period?
Well, part of it by songs. Uh,
Okay. Okay.
when
All
I
right.
was working in the archives, the papers of the Bastille in the Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal in Paris, by chance I came upon a dossier called The Affair of the 14. I'd never heard of it. I opened it, began reading it. It begins with an order that comes from Versailles. Find the author of the song that begins with, and then they gave the first line of the song, Monstre dont la noire furie, monster whose black fury. That's all the police had, the only clue, but they had to trace it down. Well, it's a long story, but it's fascinating because they finally did find someone who had recited this, and he was arrested, interrogated. He says he got it. A got it from B. B's arrested. B got it from C. C is arrested. And he says, well, and I also got these three other songs from X, Y, and Z. And soon the police have filled the Bastille with 14 people who are singing and reciting poems about the king and his mistress and the abuse of power. These are ordinary people. I mean, a lot of them are students and clerks. I even have mapped it. I have diagrams showing, who got the information from whom, and it shows you how information about royal mistresses is being spread very concretely among ordinary people. The police reports also include reports from spies about conversations in marketplaces and elsewhere. And you can almost hear people talking about the king and his mistresses. Of course, Madame du Barry did not interfere in politics the way Madame de Pompadour did, but she had been a prostitute. So now the royal mistress, formally presented at the court, is not just a bourgeoise, but someone who had been a whore. And that
Aye.
is deeply, deeply shocking to people. And I've done in other studies, I've tried to show statistically what were the forbidden bestsellers in France at this time. And Madame du Barry there was a book about her, the Correspondance de Madame la Comtesse du Barry, another private life of Louis XV. And I think I've proven that these were bestsellers. Now, again, we're talking about books and readers, but
Right.
the gossip reached everyone, and the police agents reported the gossip. So you can actually see the process. I don't think it's just a filtering down process. I think things filter up as well and turn in circles, and they move in and out of different medias, from writing, from gossip to writing to printing, and then back to gossip, into songs, graffiti, and even kind of theatricality, which I find everywhere. For example, there's a couple of times I found this sort of scene. There were certain cafes in the garden of the Palais Royal where anyone could walk in the middle of Paris. And in front of one of these, the Café du Foie, a man is reading aloud a pamphlet written by the government in favor of government policy.
Okay.
And a huge public, hundreds of people are listening to him belt out this pamphlet. They all hate the government. They hate the policy. It has to do with taxation. And so they interrupt with hisses and that kind of thing. When he's finished, they name an attorney, a judge, a confessor, and a public executioner. They put the pamphlet on a table, and the waiter at the cafe is the public executioner, and he burns it in front of everyone. So you've got a theatrical performance accompanied by a public reading of a printed work. And this view of things, this information, is spreading through many media. The theatricalities, a kind of street theater, I find that everywhere in Paris. It's really fascinating. And I think it's very important because people are acting out their attitudes, their hatred of the government.
This is so fascinating because we really do. I think in our arrogance and our myopia of who we are today and in the myopia of the present, we don't see this as we only see this in our times. I mean, this is like the modern day X back then. I mean, this was, I mean, forget the internet. These people were getting their news and they were doing their thing.
Right.
So by 1789, I mean, in your conclusion, by the time this Estates General, the French have come to really an understanding of they don't know what they want, but do they know what they want at this time? They know what they don't want, but do they really know what they want at this period?
Well, the answer is complicated. Essentially, no one foresaw the French Revolution at all.
Okay.
There had been major crises, I discussed them in the case of the book,
Mhm.
that involved violence and moments that looked like upheavals that could overthrow the government, but nothing like the French Revolution. In the course of all of these conflicts, there develops a widespread notion that the nation itself should determine things like taxation. This is not an attack on the king. The idea is that ministers have been wicked and dissipating tax money and so on. So the king should sanction a new system in which the nation is empowered to tax itself with the royal agreement. So that's not a very sophisticated idea, but it is an idea, and it's an idea that comes out in the pamphlet literature and even in this kind of street theater that I'm talking about. But people had no idea what they were getting into. What they felt was the need to change the regime, to change the course of things, a profound conviction that the reality as they experience it is changeable, and that you can change the world as it is, for a world as it ought to be.
Right.
There's a sentiment of, so to speak, possibilism, that you really can intervene in the course of events and determine their outcome. So there's a kind of sense of empowerment attached to the people themselves and a willingness to resort to violence in order to make this kind of change.
Professor Darnton, you do a really good job of, at the end of the book, explaining how the French Revolution was truly a revolution, that everything changed. It was truly a throwing off of the old, whether it was intentional or accidental. We talk about the American Revolution, and I don't know if that's the right term for what we did as Americans, because we revolted against a government, but it wasn't the French Revolution and the American Revolution really didn't have the same moral equivalency or outcomes or the consequence of the revolution. What came out of those two different revolutions was very different.
It was very different, and of course, the societies were enormously different. We didn't have a medieval past. We had no feudalism. We had no aristocracy. We did have slave owning.
We
The
did.
French who had transported a lot of slaves to the New World did not have slave owning in France itself. I mean, these are utterly different societies. I agree. I think that more recent historians have found there was a lot more violence in the American Revolution than had been thought of, and that the change really was very deep and considerable. I mean, there, of course, was this period of confusion under the Articles of Confederacy before the Constitution. But these changes were not just superficial. It wasn't window dressing about a written constitution and so on. It had to do with power and also of purging, the purging of society of a lot of people who sided with George III. So it could be that the American Revolution was more revolutionary than the way it was taught when I was an undergraduate.
Right.
But that doesn't mean it approaches the French Revolution in the extent of its effects on the everyday life of ordinary people. But I think it was a very important revolution. And in fact, it had a great influence on the outbreak of the French Revolution. So I spent a lot of time in the book talking about French attitudes towards Americans. They conjured up a kind of mythological America that was full of virtuous farmers on the frontier, full of Quakers and whalers and other, that they were tough, virtuous, civic-minded people with no established church and no aristocracy, that they were, in fact, very democratic. And there was even the creation of a French society of the Friends of the Blacks, as its title was, to fight the slave trade and slavery. They knew that slavery was, so to speak, the original sin in this new republic, and they hoped that the brave American frontier farmers and Quakers and so on would abolish slavery. There's a lot going on in all of this. It's fascinating, and the currents that went across the Atlantic Ocean between America and France were laden with values and ideas and influence.
And kind of vice versa too, because we had Benjamin Franklin, we had Thomas
Yes.
Jefferson. As we come upon the 250th celebration of the signing of the Declaration, one thing that I realize more and more, and I think my listeners probably understand this from, is that we have to understand our European history to understand our American history. You absolutely have to. The French Revolution didn't come out of a void, and the American Revolution didn't come out of a void. It was the decades and the centuries preceding it that you really have to understand the context. And
Yeah.
your book is actually, it's really an enjoyable read because you have so many vignettes in there, and there's so many things that reading through the book, I went, oh, I didn't know that person did that, or that person did that. Or I was also looking, because I lived in Paris for 4 years, looking on the map where different places were. It really is. It's a great book, and really kind of makes you really want to read more about the French Revolution. Do you have any other projects on the forefront?
Well, actually, I just published another book on the heels of the one we're discussing. The new book is called The Writer's Lot.
Excellent book, folks. Another
A
good book.
Revolution and Culture in 18th century France. And it's about what it was to be a writer. How did writers fit into French society? How did they make careers? How did they support themselves? And especially, how did they experience the French Revolution? So it's kind of a social history of literature that goes through the old regime and through the revolution, trying to show how this key figure, the intellectual, the writer, became so important in France, and what the fate of writers was during the revolutionary upheaval.
And this is a good book too, folks, because I also read this book. Anything that this man writes, that Professor Darnton writes, go read. It's good reading. And I have to say it's entertaining, and you learn a lot while you're reading it. So it really is very good. And we didn't even talk about Voltaire and Rousseau. I might have to have you on again, Professor Darnton. I really might have to maybe to talk about your second book here, the Writer's Lot.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, sir. Thank you for taking time, and keep writing. You're good. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed the
Aux armes citoyennes Que veut cette horde d'esclaves, des traîtres héros conjuris, pour qui ces ignobles entraves, c'est faire des longtemps préparés, c'est faire des longtemps préparés. Français pour nous, oh, quel outrage, quel transport il droit exciter. Ce nous commence à méditer des rois de l'antique esclavage. Aujourd'hui, citoyens, formez vos bataillons, marchons, marchons, que soit pire, abreuve nos sillons. Amour sacré de la patrie, effondré sous Diane, mon brave ange. Liberté, liberté chérie, combat avec tes défenseurs, combat avec tes défenseurs. Souviens-vous que la victoire accourait à tes mâles accents, que tes ennemis expirant voyaient ton triomphe et nos gloires. Aujourd'hui, citoyens, formez vos bataillons, marchons, marchons, que soit pire, abreuve nos sillons. Aujourd'hui, citoyens, formez vos bataillons, marchons, marchons.